It's working. We're going live. So hello there, anybody who's there. Don't mind me. I'm fooling around with stuff because I'm running kind of 3 minutes late because I was running around doing stuff, and I think everything is kind of sorted out, but we'll see. Live chat as always. I don't like it when YouTube chooses who gets to speak or who does not. I don't like that, so we're letting everybody speak. And boop, there's a window. So if I need to read it, I'll appear to be looking at the window, and that's kind of cool, I suppose. Hey, I'm Chris from Airwindows. Oh, hang on, I can turn that a little bit more light on because we could use it. And this is my Q&A thing for Monday. I may or may not have the camera set up properly. In fact, I think I probably don't, so maybe it'd be a good idea for me to fool with it a little bit. That ought to be a little better. And judging by the position of the camera, this is correct. So, cool. Got to get that kind of stuff straight. I have a little coffee for myself, but not all that much. Styrian Goldings, hey. Well, different lights and stuff, and I'm basically just throwing things together. I'm feeling a little bit under the weather. I was cranking away really hard for the previous plugin stuff. So this is definitely going to be a fool around with things and see what I can get to work. For instance here. Now Chad is behind me. Actually, it's a pity you can't be because that's a prettier background. No matter. Now Chad is very skinny. There we go. As long as we don't have a lot of people in chat, you can look like that. I have hopes of being able to refine the whole live streaming thing in various ways, but for now, this is what we got, and you're actually sitting on the turntable of a record player, which is why you bounce when I joggle things. It's a work in progress, basically, is what we're saying. Hey, Bo. So, yeah, the plugin that I released on Sunday, I did not anticipate, but I'm pretty happy with how it worked out. Let me have a quick gander over here. Fiddle with my levels so I can be maybe a little less compressed, but not too loud, but also not too quiet. David, hey. I've been chatting with David by email a little bit recently. So yeah, I can explain more about how Airwindows Dark works. It's one of those ones where it is a big deal as far as me progressing my stuff, but may or may not make much of a ripple as far as forum posts and talking about exciting plugins and having people paying lots of attention. And sometimes that's just the way that is. It's interesting to me, and it's also kind of liberating, and it's also very Patreon, that it's like the kind of stuff that I like and want seems to have not all that much to do with what is intensely saleable and a big giant success as far as making things is concerned. Weird, it's interesting. I feel that most notably in my music making, but I'm also feeling it to some extent in the plugins, and I'm kind of learning to embrace that, because it's like I wonder whether I can stabilize this by resting it in a thing. Here. Okay. Yeah, don't mind me, I'm just fooling with things even as I do the live chat. I was sitting this, which is a Wacom tablet thingy, underneath the platter, because otherwise it is over flexible and bounces around. Or I can put it under this edge of the platter, at which point we have more of a vertical bobble, and that's not good. So let's put it on this edge of the platter. Look at me fooling around with all of this kind of stuff. You don't even know what I'm talking about, but if you could see yourself as a camera, your camera sitting on this little Manfrotto tripod, which is resting on a turntable platter, which is on springs. So it's the anti-tripod, it's the anti-stable. It's literally on springs and goes boingy, boingy, boingy when I jostle the desk. Go figure, man. But, it's all good. So, yeah. I said pretty plainly in the post that people are not going to be able to hear the 24-bit dither in a regular way. And that's an important point, because it's kind of a counterpoint to the tendency of people going, oh my God, this is so wonderful, it sounds so great, you'll hear it instantly and you'll hate everything without it. And the thing is, there's a big distinction between being able to do double-blind testable comparisons and editing audio in such a way that you get an effect that people enjoy. Because I am firmly of the opinion, I stuck this in here, which is for cleaning my record platter needle. It's actually a cartridge, not a platter. Well, whatever. That's the thing, is I feel that enjoyment and appreciation of audio things is on a spectrum that goes way beyond the immediate hearableness of double-blind testing. That is a super aggressively, I like hearing the difference between a major and a minor chord. And when we get into music listening for pleasure, we're subjected to a wide range of phenomena, audio stuff happening. And our experience is very much conditioned by stuff that is on a much subtler level, but not constantly. Like if you hear aliasing or something, you hear it as an annoying aspect of the sound that's a little difficult to pin down, because it's a little difficult hearing a inharmonic artifact that's like at 5 hertz or 670 hertz or 14K, or it could be anywhere, because it is a mathematical thing. But it might be faint enough that you wouldn't pick it out every time. So you're getting annoyed by this thing about, let's say, once every 25 seconds something pops up, and it always pops up in a different place. But if you're pleasure listening, you're listening for longer than 25 seconds. And if you're able to notice this stuff as it happens, but it's not happening consistently or densely enough that you'd be able to pick it out literally every time, it's going to affect your experience of the music and the audio. So that's kind of where I see the 24-bit dark. I mean, the 16-bit is considerably more obvious, but I feel like the 24-bit is comparable to not just another dither as far as having a positive effect on things, but it's a distinct effect. It has a different quality that's not going to be to the taste of absolutely everybody. There was one fellow who was like, is it wrong if I prefer literally undithered 24-bit? And I was like, no accountant for taste. Because if you wanted like the sound of lots of detail and energy pervading everything, then dark is not going to be your friend, because it's going to make the backdrop sound dead. It'll make the backdrop sound dead and black and dark and lacking in artifacts. Much like if you listen to vinyl records, the vinyl record is literally melting the vinyl as it plays along, and has pre-emphasis and de-emphasis on its what you might call physical encoding into the groove. So it rolls off its noise and it rolls off all of its behavior quite sharply. You know, it's built out of transform, like the pickup is like a kind of transformer, and it might go through another transformer in the process. And all of these things work together to where you get something that can do good linearity to an extent in mid-range, but it'll start increasingly wiping out highs more and more. And the experience of listening to vinyl records is an experience of listening to a medium where it's just not going to give you the super highs that the most primitive digital is happy to give you. And this is desirable to hear because people evolved to listen into the deep background and listen into distant sounds. So to us, like physically, hearing extremely bright high frequencies means stuff that is really, really, really close. And if it soothes us to listen to music that is coming from a distance, then by default we are not going to have the upwards of 20 kilohertz stuff, because that dies away almost immediately in the air. So yeah, dark is a process of developing that stuff. And I have actually yet another thing happening, although it may or may not be literally next week. It's ready to go, but I've been promising things like, I think it's actually Anand who I promised amplifier settings. Man, I have a nose hair that is bugging me, don't mind me. That's just one of those burdens I'm going to have to bear. So not everybody is going to like dark. Dark is a particular flavor of things. And the interesting thing, like I said in the video, is that it's essentially orthogonal to other forms of EQ and stuff. Like you can do whatever you want in the actual processing. and you can roll stuff off all you want, and none of that is going to make the slightest difference to the output, where if you truncate, you're going to have this grating, sort of white sounding burst of unpleasant correlated noise that is undesirable. And if you TPDF dither, you're going to have that noise completely removed, but then you're going to have a bright noise floor, because TPDF dither is typically not a dark rolled off noise. Like the closest you're going to get out of that is maybe like my tape dither, which is a TPDF that is constructed in such a way that, kind of like the opposite of the Paul dither, where rather than having that be a high pass construction, you can assemble dither in such a way where it's going to have a cancellation, hopefully at a frequency that you find useful. So yeah, David's asking something, since I'm not really sticking. I did say that this was going to be about Groove, so I'll talk about that before the day is up. I'll be going for an hour and 48 minutes because the Patreon is cranking along pretty good, although it might just evaporate beginning of the month. Beginning of the month, people always leave Patreon, so it'll do a bobble as they always do. David's asking, how would you make a VST that would sound similar to AHS Electro-Harmonics Microsynth? That is an interesting question, because the thing about it is you're going to want to do some things as far as, like, here. It's a good thing that I have my pen and some paper, because I can take advantage of that and try to draw it up for you. One of the things a microsynth does is it takes a waveform and it just distorts the crap out of it. It turns it into a square wave. It can also turn it into a square wave that is limited. Like, you can do what's called a comparator and set it up so that you have to exceed this threshold to turn it on, at which point your waveform would be more like that. And when you're quiet, the signal will mute, kind of. It'll still be putting out a voltage, but it'll act like it goes silent between notes. And that's useful, because if you perfectly did a square wave, then it would start distorting everything really crazily at even very low volumes. So offsetting the 0 point is one way to make it so that your square wave will gate. Then what you do is you have like a flip-flop, so that when it changes phase, you're actuating this. And this is, in fact, I made one of those out of a single chip, one of these. I'm in the process of fooling around with this stuff a little bit. This isn't literally the one that I used, but this is the kind of thing that I used. And you take basically a flip-flop circuit and run the square wave into it, and you get a square wave that's an octave down, because it's only triggering on every other wavefront. You can keep doing that. Like, you can keep doing it and have it be another octave below that, and so on and so forth. But that's one of the technologies in there. Like, the Electro-Harmonics I know does the square wave, and I think it does an octave down. There are sometimes things like being able to make a waveform into a sort of a sawtooth, and that's another form of circuitry going on in there. I don't know that one off the top of my head. And then what you do is you have a trigger that is watching this, and making an envelope. And you have basically an envelope follower where the trigger there is setting it up for you so that it's like the envelope follower guitar pedal, a Mutron or whatever. And that's also one of the things in the microsynth. So it's all stuff like that. It's stuff like, are we making a square wave? Are we wave shaping the square wave into something else that's not simply a factor of straight up filtering it, but are we triggering another kind of wave generator? Like the semi-triangle-y kind of thing, the sort of pulse wave kind of thing. Because you can quite easily do a pulse wave generator. In fact, that's another one of the chips that I've got, is one that would be able to turn the square wave into this, because it's looking for the onset of the wave and being triggered by that, but then you can tell it how wide this is. And if you modulated that by giving it an LFO, which is another thing that you can do, it's just a oscillator, then you would have, effectively, it would act like two waveforms, and you'd have the pulse width modulation effect going on as well. And these are all things that can be done with chips, but you could also do them in a plugin, provided that you wanted to do it. Bo, you know something? I had some thoughts that are not the correct thoughts, but might be progress on the zero cross sorting plugin. That's all I can tell you for now. I had some thoughts on it, and although I don't think I can do a really refined version, I might be able to do the kludge for you. We'll see. Diogo Siqueira asks, is there a dither that works better for bass music, like techno and house? Well, techno isn't necessarily bass music. Sometimes techno can be quite bright indeed. I favor house music and like dub techno and stuff. And for that, I would say actually that Sunday's Dark, Airwindows Dark plugin, which is effectively a dither, might be suitable for that, because if you're looking for a really dark, deep kind of thing going on, you might very well want the background to be as darkened as possible and as muted and mellowed as possible, given that your high frequency stuff, if it's loud, is going to be unchanged. The dither, no, my brother didn't do anything. The dither only affects extremely quiet stuff, and it's going to make the backdrop sound, like black velvet. It's going to be like there's drapes up or something. It's going to be not glittery in any way. But for certain kinds of dub techno or deep house or whatever, that might be desirable. You might not want everything all glittery and shimmery and stuff. Certain kinds of trance, maybe you might want it to be very glittery and shimmery, but with the dark bass type music, you might want to just emphasize that. And it probably would do a good job of emphasizing it. I've actually not spoken so much, but I've emailed a little bit with family members, because we're still working through this process where my folks died a couple of years ago, and that is still a thing that we've got to kind of see through, so we're busily working on that. That's one of the reasons I was talking about the Patreon goal of, if I reach $2,000, I start making kits of stuff to send out to people at my cost, for getting stuff into the hands of experimenters, specifically hardware, specifically chips and ways of building things. And I've been working on that a lot. I have been, over the course of many months, I have got many of these chips, for instance, this particular collection. And what I need to do is work out how this goes together. I can get these. This is a thing of 25 of these things. I don't have my calculator handy. But to sell these at cost would mean that to start off with, I would be able to sell these individual chips to people for like, what, 30 cents each? And the idea is to get stuff like this. This is a priority mailbox, and probably can be used to send internationally if you pay more, I guess. I think you can use these to send stuff to literally anywhere. And the idea is, what kinds of stuff and how much of it can I fit into a box like this for a sort of care package for experimenters? And as you can see, I can't put one of these in here plus 25 times 39 might be excessively costly. The idea is, because I've been continuing to pursue this, I have now got some stuff that I need to do where I've ordered more packages of these. I've got 4 of these things of one kind of chip and 4 of these things of another kind of chip, 2 versions that I do not have yet. One of them is a shift register, like the Turing machines. I could identify the CMOS chip that is being used for the Turing machine, and so I'm working on doing the 40-cent version of that, where it's like, well, we don't have the machine, we don't have the box, we don't have the knobs, we don't have the controls, but this is the chip. So what can we do to make this functionality happen using like less than $1 worth of chips? Can we get that rolling? And put it on the perf board and stuff. And because the thing is, if you have a pile of these, you can fool around with them at will. You don't have to be worried or fuss over doing it exactly right. You should be able to just throw these things into circuit and mess around with them to see what happens. Sometimes you can get neat, interesting results. There's another thing. It's David, I'm going to have to talk about that. There's another thing that I'm getting, which is another set of chips that I need for my own experiments, because I need to make stuff for my music where I have a trigger coming in and a AND gate. And I found a chip that does, if I'm not mistaken, a double AND gate. I don't think it does a quadruple AND gate, I forget, but it does a double AND gate, either a double or a quadruple AND gate. And that means all I got to do is get power to the thing and run these inputs in. It will take, if I'm not mistaken, 12-volt inputs, and it's like buffered inputs and stuff. So you practically just have to run wires to the pins of the chip. It's really that simple. And if I make that work, then I can have like my kick drum or some kind of additional thing, or triggers for notes. I do have to test what it's like running analog through it, but I can have that stuff going into this little chip and then have a different thing, maybe running at a much slower clock. Like I've got one Turing machine that I can clock at very, 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 very slow speeds. I got it sitting actually right there, although I don't know quite what I've got it plugged into. And if I'm running a Turing machine at like 1 click every 30 seconds, and it starts throwing variations in using its like shift register stuff, it's going to make varying voltages, but I'm also going to have the gates output, which is a pulses output applied to what is normally used for the voltages output. Normally that's assembled into a a varying voltage, but you can take the pulses output, stick it directly onto the thing, and then you have a voltage, a light that lights up, and a voltage that goes on and stays on for the entire 30 seconds and will stay on as long as the gate is there. And that means I can have automated mixing that is algorithmic and generative. So what you do is you start the thing off, like maybe with that, what you do is you start it off with all the voltages on and let it start doing it, slowly changing stuff in the shift registers so that it evolves. And you start getting points where this AND gate, some of the control voltages going into that gives you a, it goes from a 1 to a 0, it goes from a voltage to nothing. And when it's at nothing, then your input is not getting through. Like your trigger that's getting through. See, here's another example of that looks like a square wave. This is a trigger for like a kick drum or something. Thump, 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 thump. And then if you have this also, and it's an AND gate, you're going thump, thump, silence, silence. Or if you had like a weirder rhythm going on, you can generate that by just a cycle and different pulse lengths. So you get a single pulse here, and then as this one sustains, the underlying cycle comes through. And these are all things that you can make with 30-cent CMOS chips. And these are also things where if I had the chip and built the thing so that I could use it, I could like run my hi-hat as a continuing beat, a continuing pulse, and then have a different pulse sort of interleaving, have another one at a completely different frequency. And the cycle of the hi-hat will become this more complicated thing, which is similar to what the, God, I'm going through paper at an intense rate here. The mini shimmery that I've got is kind of like that. I'm drawing some square waves here. What the mini shimmery plugin, which is the module, does, and this is the thing that I get my hi-hats typically from, it's a Blue Lantern thing. It's basically just 3 oscillators that are square wave oscillators, and there is a NOR gate. So the output it gives is this or this, but not both. So that produces, let's see, not that, but this. This, and then maybe a little more of that. And then nothing again, and then that again. NOR gate does this. You take these 2 square waves in, and then it's staying alive only when either one or the other, but not both, are on. So mostly it's going to be 0. This doesn't belong here. We'll cross that out. And then it takes that and goes around and does it again, but with this higher frequency, causing an even an even higher frequency buzz. It's basically just the edges of all of these, but it's a more complicated logic circuit. And if you can do that with square waves, you can do that with rhythms. Like have a set rhythm, 16th notes or something on the hi-hat, and then have like 7/8 or something going over that, and then another thing which is simply an entirely different tempo. And you'd get patterns, rhythmic patterns, that are much more interesting. And that can be done either with the NOR gates and stuff, and you can get, I've already got the chips for doing the NOR gates. I found those, I've got those on hand, I've got like 100 of them ready to fool with. I'm getting AND gates so that I can do this stuff more interestingly. And I also decided I was going to get something which the Turing machine also, and literally I got all the chips that go into a Turing machine. So hopefully I will also be able to sell you some of the parts for if you wanted to buy just the knobs and faceplate and boards of the Turing machine, and then build a bunch of them kind of like I've done, but cheaper than I did. If you were willing to not actually have the full kit, or you bought one instance of the full kit and then just went, please give me a batch of boards and I'm going to build the rest of these basically from parts. And this is something that I've been pursuing. I just have to figure it out. Like if I'm sending these boxes around, I got to figure out how to package something like this. How many of these could I fit into a box neatly? Like it's going to be less than this, so it would be yay many. And there's 2 sets of that, and then sort of leftovers. So this doesn't fit neatly into the box even diagonally. But I can't just get lots of additional packaging. Like I got a bunch of anti-static foam, but that stuff's expensive. So I'd rather come up with ways of doing it within the packaging that I'm already being sent. And again, if I was to get, it comes in these. This is normal packaging for circuitry. But 25 I feel is too many. I don't want to sell people like 25 of these and 25 of these at the 4100 cost, because it'll still add up to too many if you need to get 15 different chips to have a full set to play with. But you do need to have more than one of each, because you need to have chips to burn. You need to be able to do all kinds of crazy things with them and not worry about breaking them. There are so many useful things that can be done with these. So that's basically what's happening when I get to the 2000 level on the Patreon, and I'm cranking away at this because I want to be ready. I want to be ready when that time comes so I can start doing it. Because I feel that's a very useful way of continuing things. For if I'm like getting more Patreon money, but I'm still just doing the plugins as usual, I want to have more to offer, and that's what I'm going to try to do. Now to look over the chat, which is over here where I'm looking at it. Dither shapes many things, but normally it's not used as an EQ at all. That's what's different with the stuff that I'm doing. You should use whatever you want for stems or premasters, as long as it's not some kind of shaped dither that is imposing a strong color or character. None of my stuff is currently doing that. NJAD is essentially, it winds up being essentially random. Loud is, or not loud, that's a whole separate one. Dark is producing an effect, but as it's doing that, it's forcing a certain degree of randomness into itself anyhow, so repeatedly doing dark isn't going to hurt anything. And you could use things like Paul and double Paul are the opposite of dark. Paul and double Paul as dithers are high-pass dithers. So what you would get is, to some extent, a buildup of really high-frequency stuff that you don't necessarily want. You got to think in terms of what kinds of noise are you including in the process of getting rid of all the aliasing, and well, it's not aliasing, quantization distortion. Let me take a moment and fool around with this. I recently learned that if you turn on the analytics on the YouTubes, it shows you the actual people who are there, whereas the page that you're on stays at claiming that you have one viewer. Yeah, that's no fun. We want more than one viewer. So Zephyr saw a Bob Katz thing where mixing to -30. Well, the thing about mixing to really low levels is you're staying clear from digital distortion problems in terms of intersample peaking, but I don't feel it's super necessary. Like, one of the things about the digital recorders is that you potentially have loads of headroom, and I'm actually thinking about using that more intentionally. For instance, I would like to some of the music jams that I'm doing, and this gets into the streaming service thing, because I've been doing my music stuff, not that anybody's listening, but these are also researches of mine, and they're doing well. And I've typically done it in such a way where I tend to be clipping, I tend to be peeking out at some point or other, and I just try not to do it too much. But if I intentionally didn't do that, like this is something that I was doing, making my own copies of some DVDs that I got. I got some DVDs from a place called Burning Shed in the UK, and they're progressive rock music. They're like, they're essentially the Steven Wilson remixes of enormous quantities of different music. He's done like all of the Yes catalog, all of the Jethro Tull catalog, King Crimson, everything. This guy remixes everything. I don't like any of his work. It all sounds really digital. He has done everything to make every single sound, and some more than others, sound like they're on the surface of your eardrum with perfect digital clarity and all the 20 kilohertz stuff. And I hate everything about it, so I've never liked any of his mixes. They all just ruin what's there, but they also always include flat transfers of the original master tape. But what he does is arranges to have these flat transfers, and he does very good mixes in certain ways. They're not all like loudness ward out. They have a lot of breathing space and dynamic range in them. But I do think he kind of contrives to have the flat transfers of the original mix, which is to a analog audio tape, brought in at such a low level that it's not louder than his mix. I think he's doing that on purpose. And to me, that sounds kind of cheap. It's like, let's make sure that the original stuff doesn't sound better than my remix. Goodness no. Because otherwise, you might think that that old analog gear had qualities of its own, and it gives a vibe and feel that sounds better than my remix, and we can't have that. I feel he's doing that on purpose. You can't have the flat transfer come out louder than the remix that he does, even though the remix is not a loudness more obnoxious, overly loud remix. But here's the thing, when you do that, that is not digitally distorted, so it's leaving loads of headroom, and in digitally you can do that. I mean, if it was quiet enough, you could use word length shift gain, which really has another name, but to bring up the level of the playback essentially losslessly. All you're doing is changing the exponent of all of those variables and things, and if you do that, and you have not clipped, it is literally a lossless change. Now the thing is, if you were not doing it by exact 6 dB increments, now you have incurred a change in quantization. You need to be at a larger bit depth. And I've been capturing this stuff. I've been basically playing, because they have these copy protections on it, so you can only play the DVDs. And I don't like that. I want to put it on my Pono so that I can listen to it anytime I want. So I'm playing it back using the DVD thing, but I'm telling it that the system audio is, in fact, I show you audio capture. And then I set Twisted Wave, which is the 2-track thing that I use, to record from I show you audio capture. And then I can grab anything that's playing on the machine. And it's working around any copy protection, provided that I am capturing it at the sample rate that it was encoded in, and that my bit depth is tolerable. So what I've been doing, since these are 24-bit recordings, I've been setting the capture rate at 32-bit in Twisted Wave, and then when I save it as FLAC, it's going to be saved as 24-bit, even though it started out as a 32-bit. I believe it's 32-bit fixed point, not absolutely sure. So what I'm doing is basically capturing stuff at the very attenuated volume that they have on these DVDs, because they can't be louder than the Steven Wilson remix. Somebody might think that they were better. And then I simply normalize the entire album, call it a day, and dither it. I've been using not just another dither, and I've been very happy with that. But there are times, like if I was doing this on like an old Tangerine Dream album or something, where I would probably be happier using dark. But I dither it to the 24-bit, and then I save it as FLAC, which is 24-bit, and boom. And I've been really happy with the results. I mean, it's like doing it that way, I do think it beats vinyl, even though you can get basically the same mix and the same original analog tape recording off of playing the vinyl. And there are things about the vinyl that are nice, but then there are things about the vinyl that just don't quite manage. And you lose all that when you try to remix the entire thing on a DAW. But this listening to the original, the flat transfer of the original master, especially since they're making a point of not trying to doctor it. They're like, this is never mastered, this is never anything, this is a flat transfer of whatever was there. And kind of what they're shooting for is, it's not as good as the remix. See? It's being transferred quieter, it's not fixed in any way, it's not made brighter, and to me, that just makes it sound better. To me, I am more happy with that stuff. So what we're shooting at with this, since I'm talking basically around all of the chat in recent minutes, is there is not really a thing such as if a stem is recorded too low in level. As long as your gain staging is not too crazy, there is no harm done by coming in like 30 dB down. Bob Katz is absolutely right. You can do that in digital, especially if you're recording like at 24-bit. Half the time, if you're bringing it up in gain, basically you're going to bring your noise floor up with it as well. And although that is part of the signal, you're typically not losing anything by going in at a quieter level. In fact, if you went in at a quieter level in such a way that you didn't have to run an extra stage of preamplifier, you'd have better results. You know, as long as your digital capture is high resolution enough that you can still bring it up, like you add however many dB you need in order to get it to be the desired output volume, and like if it is less than like 6 dB per bit is about how much it takes. So if you needed to bring it up 24 dB, that's only 4 bits. And if you captured it at 24-bit, then you're still, you had all that headroom, but your noise floor is not all that significantly different. It's basically a gain staging thing. Now, I'm going to be bouncing around a fair bit today. Things are a little chaotic around here, but David mentioned one thing that I want to talk about, and it has to do with this stuff. It has to do with this plan of putting large quantities of these little chips and things into people's hands for dirt cheap, because you can buy them for like 100 or so at a time for about $40. But what if you wanted like 16 different kinds of chips to play with? Well, 16 times $40 is still a lot, and you're never going to use all of those. And if you had just one of them, that would be very, very, very cheap, but then you couldn't experiment too wildly because you'd be afraid of breaking the only one that you've got. So there's got to be a middle ground in there somewhere where you can have, like, these are the ones that you can do the tube sound fuzz from Craig Anderton's electronic projects for musicians, because I've got lots of those chips. I've even got vintage ones of those chips that I've had for many years. And these are the ones that are AND gates, and these are the ones, like these are literally the ones that you can make a simple oscillator out of. 40106 Schmidt inverters, capacitors and resistors and stuff, you make these into little square wave chips. And they could be clocks, they could be notes, they could be anything. And I've got 100 of them. So if you wanted to make a synthesizer and it was just a drone synth with a whole pile of these things, say if you had like 10 of these chips, that's still only about $3 or $4, and that'd work. And I'm just going to be figuring out what is a good way of getting a big, large collection of these chips into people's hands for very, 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 very cheaply. But here's where this doesn't hurt me, David, as far as selling them at cost. You must understand that I'm not going to get into a situation of being like, I am now obligated to do any amount of these chips at cost. Oh, you wanted to do 2,000 of these at cost? I guess I'd better go and order 2,000 and send them to you. That's not how that's going to work. Instead, when I hit that level of Patreon, and I'm dead set on doing this, anything beyond that, I will do that much for whoever is like first in line, and it's up to me as to who I choose, but I will get around to everybody eventually, hopefully. And I'll do that much per month, and then stop. Like if I have $2,001, 2001, A Space Odyssey, a Chris Odyssey, that's almost meaningless, because that would be a situation where I said, okay, by the rules of what I decided to do, I will do $1 worth of at-cost stuff per month. That's almost nothing. That's like 4 chips and that's it. I'd probably still do it, but it doesn't wind up being much. Now, let's say there are lots of people who want to get involved in this, and I don't know that's going to be true, but supposing there is. Suppose you want to get these chips for like 39 cents, rather than having to buy them by the 100 and spend hundreds or thousands of dollars to get yourself set up with all this, which you can of course do. Anybody can go to Mouser and order this stuff, at least if I haven't like bought them out of all these things. You can get this stuff too. It's just going to cost you as much. And you'll end up, if you get them for the really dirt cheap quantities, like the hundreds at a time, that will get you down into that 20 cent or so range. That means that it's not very effective. But if you wanted to get them from me, then you would just have to get the Patreon to a high enough level where I'm doing more each month. Like, if I got, say, the Patreon to $3,000 a month, and that seems crazy, but I mean, we're closing in on 2, then I would be doing up to $1,000 a month at cost of this stuff. Now, it's not all chips. Like the things that I'm looking at here, the chips are actually one of the cheapest parts. I'm also looking at trying to find out where consolidated wire is coming from, because I think it's all electronics, someplace or other. One of the electronic wholesalers that I like sell spools of wire, and they sell these great spools of wire that are basically steel wire that are 22 gauge, color-coded insulation. They're easy to strip, they're really great wire, and they'd be perfect for this kind of stuff because you can use it to wire to stuff. Since it's steel wire, it's very sturdy. I'm using it for my patches. I've got all kinds of patches on the modular synthesizer that are going from simple plugs through a single wire to the output, which is another connection somewhere else. And I've made a cajillion patches out of that. But if you have IC sockets, which is another part of this concept, where these kinds of things can plug into, you can also plug in 22 gauge into that. You can get IC sockets where you could repeatedly plug 22 gauge into that, and it would be fine, and it makes a wonderful connection that will convey like an amp of current. These connections will convey really large quantities of current. And so I'm looking at replacing everything, like switches, knobs, pots, all of that kind of stuff. I have a neat thing happening on the pot front, by the way. Potentiometer, since you wondered. I should be able to replace all of those things with stuff that is 1/100th the cost, literally 1/100th the cost, and still functional, as long as you were down with working with this peculiar way. Like instead of a switch, you have a IC socket and a little wire that you plug into one of the holes of the IC socket in order to manipulate the thing. Because a switch will cost $3, but the IC socket costs 30 cents. Stuff like that. And again, if I was doing like $3,000 a month on the Patreon, I will have committed to doing $1,000 a month of at cost parts distributing in these kits and ways of getting stuff happening. And the chips are very cheap. IC sockets are often more expensive than the chips half the time, if they're good. And the perf board is the remaining part of that, because I can get that stuff and I can probably make it fit in these boxes as well. I'm trying to work out how to do all of these things. And you can score that and break it along the little holes and make it in such a way that if you drilled a hole really well into it, you'd be able to use it in a Eurorack system. If you set up your power correctly so that you're powering your little circuit. I've done this before. I've actually got some of them sitting over there. I'm not going to necessarily go and dive and show you unless anybody wanted. Probably you don't. But the perf board gets to be like $7.60 for a big piece like this. So I get them 10 at a time, and it costs like, and actually more like $14.70 for an even bigger piece like this. So you can get them 10 at a time for $147, and I've just done that again today. So I'm building up a big pile of these things. And get into enough of that stuff, and it starts adding up to serious money. And it means that you could end up going through $1,000 a month of just stuff at cost. The point being, I can do this and put stuff into people's hands for very cheaply if I figure this stuff out correctly. Have it so that, it's like, what's that place that did the Zox boxes and stuff? They're still doing lots of great things. It's a real experimenter haven, but I don't remember the name of it right now. I have too many other things to think about. But that place, where they're selling these experimenter kits to build your little tiny robot and stuff. Well, screw that. How about for under $100, build an entire massive synthesizer system that takes up like this faceplate this big, full of all these chips and weird little connections and things, patched like a buchla, where you're patching basically micro miniaturized banana jacks that can handle an ampere of current, and just sort of homebrewed. It's the secret briefcase concept. And that is something else that I can show because I got this handy. Here's the secret briefcase. The idea is you should be able to get something like this. Basically rip it apart. See, this is the inside of the briefcase. Ends up having this kind of stuff. And take simple pine wood slats and go across this way at a spacing where you're doing stuff that would end up fitting in a Eurorack module. But you're not making a Eurorack module. You're making these perf board things for much more cheaply than the faceplates and things of Eurorack would cost you. And you've got your wooden slats. You got your perf board going along here, little individual modules, and you're thumbtacking them in to the pine, which is holding everything in place. That completely gets around so many expensive electronic things that are required for making like Eurorack stuff or any normal. Basically, this whole concept is how can you get a really large, elaborate, non-trivial electronic music system built for next to nothing? What are the limiting factors here? And this is one of the things where I deeply enjoy diving into this kind of stuff, because you wind up stumbling across things like, I mentioned potentiometers. I mentioned a pot thing I was going to tell you about, and hasten to add that it is potentiometers because I don't drink or use, so other kinds of pot things are not available to me. This is. You know how much a potentiometer costs? You're lucky if you can get one for $1. Like one for $1. A good fancy one that might go in a guitar or something might be like $3. A knob all by itself could be as much as $3. You're getting up to like a total of like $5 for each knob that you're trying to build into something. That adds up real fast. That means that if you're trying to build something like a mixing board or whatever, and you've got your output level, and you want a treble and bass and mid-range, and you want a sweepable frequency and stuff, like, okay, you got chips and parts and things. Meanwhile, you're at like $20 per channel just for the knobs. This is not approachable. This is like individual builders. Some of this stuff gets really ugly as far as being able to afford to experiment with any of it. So I found a place called Electronics Goldmine, which is one of the places I follow that I'm deeply into. And they had, I say had because I bought everything they had, a special. They were trying to blow out some 200 kilohertz trim pods. Quite nice ones, really. They're these little tiny, I think, Panasonic trim pods. And you need a Phillips head screwdriver to adjust them. Itty bitty little things. And I say 200 kilohertz, that's not right. 200 kilo ohms, which is a relatively normal value for a pot. You could use that for a mixer. You can have the inputs going through that and use it as a mixer. You'd be able to trim it to some extent, but it's also a good solid large resistance to go into for isolating inputs on a mixer. You can use that for various different kinds of oscillator. How much do you think those are? Surprise, they're still going to be closer to $1 or something if you were buying them one at a time, or if you were buying them new and spiffy, but this is not new and spiffy. This is a wholesaler that buys abandoned stuff and then tries to resell it. And they were trying to blow it out. So they wanted to sell their packages for $80, and they were like, this is a blowout. We have 4 of these packages left. We'll sell them for $40 each. Each of these packages contained 1,000 of these trim pots. So, as part of this project, I will be able to offer not only these and the other ones that I get, and any further ones that I get, but I managed to decide what kind of potentiometer we're using for people experimenting with. You're going to have to work around these or simply not use them. But suppose I design a circuit that is a nice little mixer circuit, and it uses like from 0 to 200K of resistance as part of it. Now we can use those because the price of 4,000, as I bought all that they had, 4,000 of these little trim pots ends up being about 3 cents each. 3 cent potentiometer, not $3, 3 cent. And this is what I'm trying to do with this experimenter stuff. As you can tell, I deeply enjoy this, but I also feel that it is super helpful because when you can put stuff in people's hands that they can afford to fool around with, like maybe you're doing a circuit and it turns out that you're adjusting of your oscillator, you're going to need 1 kilo ohm, not 200. So basically, you've got this little thing and it's almost useless because you can use 2 of them in parallel and they will tend to sort of, the combination of the 2 will give you your end result. You'll have a certain amount of finagling with that, but the point being, you don't have to spend $3 or $5 for a potentiometer and exactly the right knob and stuff when you can just wire some of these things together, make oscillators, start listening to them, and use stuff like this 3 cent trim pot to adjust the output level or your filter cutoff or whatever. It's like, well, is it not exactly the right thing? Yeah, it's not exactly the right thing. It's a weird value, hopefully usable, but it's a 3 cent, not exactly the right thing. So deal with it because you get to have lots of them. You get to have lots and lots and lots of them. And it's all a matter of figuring out how easily can I divide stuff like this that I get up into smaller packages that I can then just throw in a box and let people have. Because I can't necessarily even sit around, like if I was getting resistors and it was the same deal, it's like, okay, I got 60,000 resistors that were wholesale. So it's a particular value of resistor. We can use that. And I got it on a blowout, so it costs 0.00001 cent. How am I going to count those out and add them up? No, but maybe I can weigh them. Maybe you can buy resistors by the 1/10 of an ounce. And doing stuff like that just makes it more enjoyable, more approachable, at which point it becomes a thing where, guess what? It's Christmas morning. We came up with a thing where I am doing my at cost thing, and I've come up with a selection of things that we can put into a box like this, and you can spend like, I don't know, I haven't really decided what the exact level is. $20? What? $20, $30, maybe something completely bonkers like $60 or $80, at which point you get the equivalent of like all of the parts out of a Black Corporation Deckard's Dream. That's many, many thousands of dollars worth of synthesizer. It wouldn't sound anything like that, but you'd have all the same oscillators and LFOs in terms of sheer numbers. It just would work wildly, wildly differently, but you'd have all the bits for making that many oscillators, that many filters, that many LFOs, that many envelope generators, that many everything. Sequencers, you name it, for about $80. And then you just start putting stuff together. I'm going to be needing to draw up a bunch of reference pictures, maybe on pages like this, that will be downloadable as PDFs, so it's not like you have to buy those, for just what do the pins on these do? How do you connect them up? I did a bunch of stuff when I was a lot younger on just the 4049 chip alone, because the 4049 chip is a 6 inverters, and it's a very interesting little thing because it is the chip that made the Craig Anderton tube sound fuzz. And it's a pretty good description of it, because the thing about this particular circuit in this chip, of which I have more than 100 available to distribute now, but I could get many more. The thing about that chip is that you wire just one of those up, or two if you want to get really funky, and bias it with a single resistor and some capacitors to go in and out of it, but a single resistor to short circuit the output and input together and make it conduct always. You get this super soft clip. It's like the hardware equivalent of density. It's like the hardware equivalent of the density plugin. It is indeed a tube sound fuzz plugin, because it does not have the grating transistory edge. It's field effect transistors, FETs. It has super soft clip. It's incredibly squishy and soft sounding, in fact. If you've ever heard one of the Craig Anderton tube sound fuzz circuits, it's really quite impressive as to just how mellow and soft it is. But you don't have to stop there. I also built equalizers out of this circuit, because if you've got a gain stage, that's all you need for, like, quickly sketch this out. Do I have a spare? I do. Resistors. Capacitors. Half of a 4049 chip is 3 inverters. More resistors on the output, and then capacitors. Resistors. This is the circuit that I built. It's that quick, that easy. You can do these things too. And it'll get you to be more of like your Chris from Airwindows kind of person, of building and trying things and making stuff happen. Basically, the way this works is as follows. You have the input signal coming in, and the capacitors limit what frequencies get to go into these amplification stages. These amplification stages all invert, so the output will also invert, but there's a number of ways you can work around that if you even need to. The capacitors here are what's called part of an integrator, and they roll off high. So if you're going through a capacitor here, that rolls off lows. It doesn't let lows past a certain point. A little tiny one, it lets through only the brightest highs. Big enormous one, it lets through lots of lows, but it doesn't let through DC. Ones on this is the feedback loop. It's an inverter. What that means is that if this is shorting this stuff out, it won't let highs through, and this won't let lows through. Now you have a bandpass. You have something that's blocking the lows here and blocking the highs here. It's blocking the highs super effectively. You'll notice that this one doesn't have the capacitor. That means that this is your, the sizes of these are wrong, but this is your high frequency output. It's not rolling off highs at all. Although you can have a little tiny one just to suppress some of the supersonic kind of stuff, or if it's going into oscillations. There's all kinds of interesting things that can happen. So if you have this, which is wiping out the highs here, be the same as this, or no, let's see. So the way that it basically works is you'd use the same value for some of these. Like, here's your high frequency one, so it's letting through only this, so we use this for this high frequency remover, and it should end up being about the same levels because you're letting this frequency through here and then blocking it here and letting through this amount. That'll be more in the mid-range, it's larger, and then that goes here, so you're using the same one for here and here. So this is only mid-range and this is base. It's blocking everything above the mid-range or highs, and this lets through your big low frequencies here. These are things that are possible to do. In fact, done properly, these are things that are possible to do for 30 cents. All you got to do is get a hold of the right things for building them, and I delight in finding some of that stuff. Like, it was great fun ordering the trim pods, because I had seen them and I was like, that actually sounds about perfect. Let's make it happen. And I placed the order and I got 4,000 trim pods for relatively cheaply. It was like $150 or so. At the moment, I can spare that for a good cause. And the cause is getting people to have potentiometers for their builds for 3 cents a potentiometer. It might be tiny, but it'll work, and you'll be able to build stuff with it. And half of the fun with things like this, you don't have to be manipulating they don't have to all be good knobs and big potentiometers and controls and stuff, because you have to do all that. Half of the fun with some of this stuff is building generative stuff, building things, and that's kind of the idea of the sacred briefcase. The idea with the sacred briefcase is build an entire music system into a box like this for cheaply, but build an entire music system into a box like this. So you open it, plug it in, and it is making all this crazy music that is not just drones. It could be, but not just drones, but expanding upon that to make more complicated stuff. This system over here that I've built, it's using just all existing Eurorack stuff, and I enjoy the heck out of it. But so many of the basic functionalities can be done with these 30-cent chips. Like some of the Turing machine stuff, which is a big part of the brain, is using about $2 worth of chips in total and a bunch of support stuff. But when I'm actually using it, I'm not necessarily controlling the knobs. I've set them up ahead of time to do something that I wanted, and then I'm just letting it think. And this is what I think would be cool to have people doing. And this is what I'm interested in putting in people's hands for if the Patreon goes above $2,000 and I start doing stuff at cost. And again, like David Picks the Muzzle was concerned about this. If this becomes a big hit and lots of people want to do it, they're going to be limited by the amount that I've agreed to do per month. And the only way that they can get me to do more per month is to jump on the Patreon, which they'd be encouraged to do anyway, because it would be a good project worth supporting and worth doing. But that would be their way of getting involved with that, rather than being like, I'm going to make a profit off of specifically the sale of these things. That's not how that works. I don't make a profit off of the resale of these things that I'm getting in large quantities and designing things that I can put in people's hands for very, very cheaply. Instead, I am making money off of the Patreon. And there's another thing, which is if I'm selling this stuff at cost, I'm not really losing anything. So that's fine. Like, think of it this way. If I was doing like the $3,000 level, if I'm doing $1,000 worth of business of this kind of stuff, well, that's exciting. That means getting a lot of parts and redistributing them, which is complicated, sure, but it's fun. Yeah, I think you can tell that this is fun for me. And it would mean I'd be sending out $1,000 worth of all these little chips and things, but you know what? I'd be going and finding them as cheaply as I could, but then I get the money back. It's not like I'm going to be making myself go broke on the back of doing something like that. I would be getting like cost out of it, so there's that. So let me have a look over the chat, seeing as it is getting towards 12:24, and we got about another half hour practically. I'm going until 12:48, so 12:50, something like that. One of the things that was mentioned earlier, I'm scrolling up for just a little bit. Scrolling up some more. Streaming services do sometimes have a standard of turning up things. And I'm pretty sure YouTube is one of the worst offenders. They also put their own limiter on stuff. They put automatic gain control in things. And Twitch, not so much, although I'm not really streaming to Twitch anymore because it never really amounted to anything for me. But YouTube will turn your stuff up more than it already is. So bear that in mind. Twitch has more accurate audio. And yeah, they'll normalize things, but David, I have noticed that they do seem to be turning stuff up. But they're also turning stuff down. They're turning stuff all over the map. You just got to deal with it. David is suggesting building a cheap synthesizer out of this stuff and then setting fire to it at the end of a stream. Not impossible, but not the most likely thing for me to do. Oh yeah, that'd be colorful. Foco is enjoying some of these things. Newish, not just another Dither 24. Presumably in, use the one in monitoring if you're using one. Also in Studio 10. And yeah, dark. So dark is the different flavor of that kind of stuff, but they're all basically the same kind of thing. There is a loudness penalty website. Yep, you can find something like that. And if a stem is recorded too low in level, it's kind of like you're creating something out of nothing, because if you're turning stuff up, it's possible to literally get exactly as much as you already had with no loss if you're able to turn it up by exact 6 dB increments. That's what word length shift gain does, which is not its real name, but YouTube, you know. The way that works is it's changing only the exponent in the floating point representation of the number in the DAW. And when you do that, you have not re-quantized anything. All of your little fixed point bits in the floating point are exactly the same as they were. You could put it back and lose nothing. The only requirement is that none of your output samples should clip once you're done. But the way that works is if you have a existing noise floor, whether that be the converter or whatever it is that you're doing, and you're using word length shift gain to turn it up exactly to 6 dB, it's an exact multiplication by 2 or 4 or 8 or 16 or so forth, then it's changing the exponent of every single sample without touching the mantissa, so nothing is getting re-quantized, and everything is exactly twice or 4 times or whatever as loud as it was before. And that includes the noise floor. It includes literally everything. As long as you're not clipping on the output, if you went and put it back, it would be literally, utterly exactly the same, completely lossless. So this is a form of gain trim that is lossless digitally. And that's useful to know about. So if you're doing stems that are too low, you might want to make them be at least 6 dB too low. Like peak at minus 12 or less. And then you'll always be able to do lossless gain bump for whatever it is that you're doing. For instance, if you were doing an analog mix and you were like, I just captured this and I would like to play it back out of the thing without even dithering it or anything because I want it to be utterly and completely lossless where I didn't do anything to it. You could do the word length shift gain and then there would be no purpose to even, it would be like recording the thing and then playing it back out of the converter without touching or changing anything. Something that I sometimes do. And it's not creating something out of nothing. It's just taking exactly the data that you have, and like the exact data that you have can always be presented going up or down in 6 dB increments if it's in the DAW, if it's in a 32-bit format, because the DAW is recording samples using an exponent, and that's different for every sample, but as long as the total range of them is within, like, not within 6 dB of clipping, then you automatically have some changes that you can do that change the gain and have no effect on the sound whatsoever. So let's have a look at some of these chats and things. Average is not at all a linear phase EQ. Averaging is not anything like a linear phase EQ unless you were using only the middle sample of the averaging, which you're not, so it's not linear phase. It also does not have pre-ring, and it doesn't really have post-ring because the shape of averaging is a rectangular section. So it's not like it has a ring because it doesn't have any, like the equivalent convolution impulse. It is its own convolution impulse. It's a convolution impulse that is just a brick. It's like, nyeh. And doing equalizer things often involves a convolution impulse or equivalent of a convolution impulse, whether that be done directly in finite impulse response, like an averaging, or whether that be something like a biquadratic infinite impulse response, where you're effectively doing a thing that amounts to the same as a series of samples to convolve the thing by that goes on forever. The IIR stuff will always have a post ring, but nonlinear phase stuff routinely doesn't have a pre-ring. Oh, and yeah, funny you should mention that, David. I have been thinking more in terms of doing a more complicated averaging plugin, because it seems like it would be fun to build something like that up. Some of the changes that I've done in plugin portings and getting into things more recently, I have the amp sim stuff that I need to do from back in the day. And on looking at them, I'm looking at them and going, oh geez, I really need to recode some of these things, because they do stuff like they make IIR filters that are like 25 pole IIR filters that are just very simple and primitive, and that's a way of doing stuff. It's some of the ways that I got my sounds back in the day. But they're doing them manually. It's like IIR1, or IIR-A, IIR-B, IIR-C, IIR-D, and so on up to like Z or V or something like that. And I was just doing them manually. And the thing about it is, at the time I thought there was a gain. I thought I benefited in some way from doing that. And in talking with my brother Dan, I learned why I didn't. Because you're keeping separate memory management for everything. But if you're making, say, an array and going, okay, IIR square bracket 25 end square bracket, and then you make a little loop and go, okay, for x equals 0 to 25 IIR x, this and that and the other thing. Rather than having pages upon pages of stupid text, you wind up with this one little neat thing that's a device that works for you and does your, and all it's doing is taking a one additional variable and using it to work through your array, rather than all these different separate ones, just to get away from using the one additional variable. And modern computers, they can do all kinds of math very easily and quickly, but they don't like being given unreasonable numbers of extra variables. So the thing that I thought was helping me was actually hurting. And I'm working on that, and the averaging thing of stacking up multiple averaging things is very suitable to this kind of work. So I'm looking into that one. That is something that I could see happening, although maybe not next week, but we'll see. So your stacked averaging thing, and believe me, the stacks would not be set at 2. That would be another adjustment. You'd be having a continuously variable set of taps where each new tap gradually gets increased until it is at full volume, and that gives you the slow introduction of taps. But you would also get the stacked where you'd have instances of it, same deal, and again, each new averaging being included would also be gradually included rather than just switched into by, it's the same process that I think I'm using in Grooveware and Crunchy Grooveware of introducing, I think that was also in DBS, the newest DS, having multiple instances of things, and then as you bring a new one, you're doing a quick little dry wet of introducing the new instance. That way you don't just switch into it, you can sort of fade into it. And then as you've got the one fully at full volume, you've got the next one, and that starts coming in as well. So it's a continuous process. Much like my DRes is a sample rate cruncher and a bit cruncher, but they're both continuous processes rather than discrete, using the same technique. So that's what will happen with that. Sebastian needs USB port fixing. I wish I knew how to fix it too. Scatterhound is basically like, why aren't you doing Slate's rack system? I'm not going to do a Slate rack system. I do not like the way that kind of stuff works. That's not how plugins be. It's not a good way of doing it. Oh, the coffee. So, I think, David, you're coming back to the stems and premasters. Should you generally only use TPDF? Not necessarily. No. You can use anything that isn't like UV22 or whatever, or POW-R3. There are various dithers that have existed that if you stacked them, you would get more of the coloration that they produce, because they're high energy things that are trying to basically take the existing dither and noise shape away the energy in a range that they're trying to clean up. They are kind of like nonlinear phase things in their own way, in that they are using error, kind of like error diffusion, to remove energy in frequency bands that they've decided the energy shouldn't be there, But you can't get something for nothing out of that sort of thing. So what they end up doing is generating a lot of excess energy in places where you are supposed to not hear it. Like some of these, like there's the old megabit max dither, which I think ended up in isotope ozone. But they can clean up the area around 1K an awful lot, very impressively, but they do that by throwing a lot of energy up around 20K. And since this is like a cheat, since this is like rearranging energy in a way where you're going to get additional artifacts, you're just not supposed to be able to hear them. If you stack that up on top of itself, it's going to build up. If you stack like megabit max on top of itself, if you stack power 3 on top of itself, if you stack UV22 on top of itself, it's going to add up. It's going to become obnoxious. If you stack TPDF on top of itself, it's just more noise. There's no difference. And the ones that I have made, like not just another dither, like I believe dark, they're algorithmic. So there is no just blindly stacking stuff on top of itself. Instead, if you went and ran it repeatedly, you would either get exactly the same output again, or it would continue to recalculate and have roughly the same amount of noise level and roughly the same behavior. So with other than TPDF, the ones that I've got that are not noise-shaped dithers are, I believe, safe to use. And TPDF is safe to use if you like that, but the ones that I've got that are not noise-shaped dithers are also safe to use, especially if you're going out into analog or something. Like, I think the idea is if you're rendering stems or premasters, you must be rendering to a fixed point like 24-bit, and that's why you're asking. If you were not going to a fixed point, you wouldn't be talking about doing the dither anywho. And yeah, something like double pol or tape dither is also an option. Each of those things is going to generate its own kind of subtle tonality. Something like pol dither or whatever, it's just TPDF. It just happens to be a high-pass TPDF. So the audio will be unaffected. The audio of any correctly assembled TPDF is going to be correct on the output. It's just what added noise have you added. And if you repeatedly add pol dither or double pol, what you will get is a buildup of high frequency noise that is maybe a little quieter than straight flat noise like in TPDF. But both of those will build up noise as you continue to layer them. Yeah, so David, I respect that. David Robertson likes a average tap of 2 because at 96K it puts the first null neatly, well, Nyquist is technically a factor of the sampling rate. What you're thinking of is it puts the first null neatly on 20K. So it puts the first null neatly at where your hearing typically basically runs out. Or certainly your hearing acts differently at 20K. Like ability to distinguish individual notes goes way down. And you can get the energy there, but your ability to distinguish details and things about 20K tones is way less than if they were like 2K tones. So that's fair. Yeah, you would be able to select a tap of 2. Just take the knob and have it be like, okay, it says 2. That is what I wanted. With other things in TPDF, it wouldn't necessarily be bad if they are well behaved, like if they're not generating a lot of energy. Again, noise-shaped dithers. Noise-shaped dithers like Power 3 is quite a high energy one. megabit max to the extent that that is still a thing. I'm not sure whether they changed it, but back in the day, that was a very high energy dither. Stuff that is using specifically noise shaping doesn't get along with post-processing. And the stuff that I'm doing in terms of NJAD, in dark and so on, is not using noise shaping at all. What are the advantages and disadvantages of using two different dither algorithms in a row? If you like the sound of using them in a row, then that's fine, and there's no special disadvantage to it. Double Paul and tape dither are indeed noise-based. Save coffee plugin. Yeah, that'd be good. If I come up with something that needs that, I'll totally use it. Forever is asking, are Airwindows plugins compatible with higher rates? Yes, indeed. I don't necessarily knock myself out making them be compatible for 384K. Like, for instance, dark is using an internal buffer to get an area of sound through which it's developing its sense of what a rolled off smooth sound would be. It is taking this extension of audio and extending it outwards to where it can identify what smooth would be below like 3 kilohertz or so. And that is a small little extension, but if you're at 96K, it's twice as long because it's running more samples in there. And if you're at 192K, it's 4 times as long. And beyond that, it starts to get pinned to, I think I have a maximum of 100 taps in there. And so if you started doing like 1000K or a megahertz still at 24-bit audio, then you would wind up shifting the behavior of the thing up. But generally, my stuff will either do its math, like biquads should handle any higher sample rate, I think. They shouldn't have any problem with it because they're doing the calculations based on a sample rate that they're being given. Stuff that involves buffers, like delays and things, often if I'm doing delay plugins, the delay plugins have a fixed buffer because I don't want to produce a situation where you're running your DAW and suddenly you're at 384K for no good reason, so the plugin is now demanding 64 gigs of RAM and everything dies. I don't like doing that, so I like specifying buffers as a fixed size and not having the potential surprises of going, okay, now we're running at 192K, and so now all of these delay plugins are demanding more RAM than exists in the universe. So often the delays will, or things like MV. Things like MV, you might get the same sound by setting them differently, and there will be a limit because essentially if you're not redefining the buffer based on the sample rate, which I think is possible to do, but there's a gotcha, which is you can kill your machine by setting it wrongly, and you have only one fixed buffer, it seems unreasonable to not let people at low sample rates use the full range of it, which would mean if you're at 48K, you can do 10 seconds of delay. And if you're at 96K, you can do 5 seconds of delay. And if you're at 192K, you can do 2.5 seconds of delay, and so on. That is the sort of thing where if you're defining the same buffer for the delay or the effect of that kind, then the only way to make it be exactly the same at all sample rates is to have lower sample rates waste and not use most of it, and I never thought that was a good idea. So those things will behave differently at different rates. But by the same token, they're in a way they're exactly the same. It's just that you're running them faster. I agree with David on the seeing very little advantage to using 192K instead of 96K. Kinda. Because I got a Pono player over there, and Neil Young was very into his 192K. He was really pumped about that. I was never that impressed because the thing about it is 96K is good sort of headroom for avoiding aliasing. It's reasonably good headroom if you know what you're doing. And the frequencies that you can capture and play back include a really wide range of everything. And in order to be working with sound that really makes use of like 192K, the stuff that uses that has to be really bright and upfront. Now, again, kinda. Because the thing about it is, like, technically you're working with stuff that you really can't hear. You're only like sensing it in your bones or something like that. And although I don't personally feel a lot of, like, I am not super into doing sounds that are so in your face that they feel like they're inside your skull. And it's like, oh, and this delicate whispery noise, it's part of the mix. And it was so far forward that it was like inside my brain. You can do stuff like that with 192K. I just typically choose not to. I don't really want any sounds doing that. I like stuff being in a soundstage and like at a bit of a distance, you know. I like the scale and size of things. And so my wishes, audio-wise, are often, if you really were careful enough with it, would be taken care of by like 44.1K. But then having the 96K there gives you some flexibility and the ability to have sharper noises and textures in things with more sort of discrimination in them. Like you have the occasional overtone, or some kind of, like, one of my synthesizers starts doing a bright thing, or I have some kind of skronky noise in there that has a lot of character, or some scraping percussive sound, and these things can extend upwards to where I'm making use of the 96K range. I typically won't be doing anything that really makes use of 192K. And if you mastered stuff where it's like, wow, I can super hear the difference, I probably wouldn't like it very much because it would be so bright. It would be so bright. So yeah, I'm with David as far as the 96K. I prefer that, but kinda, because you can do stuff with 192K where you're like, I kind of think that maybe this is giving me a benefit, but it has to be certain kinds of things. And those are creative choices I typically don't make. You really want to have a sort of hallucinatory, ultra bright clarity kind of thing going on. Otherwise, it's absolutely a moot point. So Forever is asking, where can I find sources to learn about coding? This is a good last question because we're up at 12:52, so we've gone about as long as we need to. Anybody asking final questions should ask them real quick. I would like to be offline by 1. And I'm a newbie. Where can I find sources to learn about coding? Well, the trick is coding is both a very big question and also you can take wrong paths in it. Like, you could go to school for that. It's not necessarily going to help you do what I do. So what I would say is start experimenting with stuff. Learn to build things. This is why I'm trying to put like electronic parts in people's hands so that they can learn to build things by doing it. Studying stuff isn't necessarily going to help you that much. You basically want to learn how to get the information. But in terms of coding, come up with stuff where you can start doing the thing. Now, I will make a suggestion. If you're at all interested in game making, what you want to do is go and get Godot engine. The Godot engine is a open source game engine that's being developed. It's better at 2D stuff. It's not that great at 3D stuff yet, but 3D is a whole other can of worms, and it's difficult in its own right to fool with. But you can use Godot engine to make anything from like games to sort of calculators and stuff. You could make a calculator for doing like audio things as long as you learned how to use the controls and stuff. I think Juice is unbearable. I can't use Juice myself. But, and that involves heavy programming. You can run the Godot engine and do stuff within it in its own little kind of programming without running other programming languages or other like DAWs and interfaces and stuff, or whatever the programming equivalent of a DAW is. The Godot engine, you can use GDScript, which is a pretty acceptable, it's supposed to be a Python-like programming language. And the thing about learning to program by fooling around with stuff in Godot engine is that you might think of things to do there and start experimenting and trying stuff, because the basic things of learning how to program are like, this is a variable, this is a thing, how can I change this to be into something else? Here's my little guy moving along the screen. I want it to look like he's jumping over this rock. What do I need to do to make it feel like this guy is jumping over the rock? Is he moving right? Is he jumping properly, or is this unnatural? Does this not seem like a proper jump when the guy is jumping over the rock? And those are the questions you need to ask. Learning how the programming language works and going to school and learning how to do databases or God knows what does not help you as far as the ability to look at the thing and go, how can I imagine this to be something that I want? What would I like to make happen here? Those are the questions that you need. And the Craig Anderton's Electronic Projects for Musicians is an exceptional resource. As far as more advanced stuff, he already has stuff like EQ and things in there. Once you get past that, you start derping around on like Reddit or something, looking for, there's another, like, if you like that, there's a YouTuber, you don't even have to buy the book, Electronic Projects for Musicians. Look Mum No Computer is going to be your new best friend. He's this noisy British guy. He has 2 different channels. One of them is him being really noisy and like ranting wildly about stuff and making Furby organs and organs out of flamethrowers and so on. And he's found some YouTube success doing that. But he's got another channel which is just a little, takes it down a notch, because what he's really about is building stuff from scratch. And if you're interested in the idea of Craig Anderton's Electronic Projects for Musicians, you don't have to go and buy it. You can go and look at this guy's YouTube stuff. Again, it is Look Mum No Computer. And he will happily tell you about ways of wiring these circuit parts together to make things like the simplest oscillator ever with like 4 parts. And he'll be really enthusiastic about it. Like, I hope I can develop that kind of enthusiasm when I start doing my own things. It'll probably just be my flavor, but I do get worked up about some of this stuff. This guy is 6 times as worked up as me, and he will make building a simple oscillator out of this one little transistor and some parts seem so exciting and cool that you'll want to do it. And he'll do it all on stripboard, which is a kind of building that I'm not actually that much of a fan of. I like to do stuff on perf board and use wires to connect things. But or make dead bug style stuff where it's like you're shaping all the wires really interestingly and making this little sculpture out of wires and electric connections. That's what I like. But this guy is going to be, you need to go and look at that. That'll keep you busy for a while. And then you start looking at things like DIY synth stuff. Go find the DIY synth on Reddit or wherever. And pretty much that's all you're really going to need. And because at some point you just start thinking of like, no, I want this kind of EQ. I want 4 channels rather than 3. What do I need to change in this to make 4 channels rather than 3. And you need to get to the point where you grab your stuff and start building it rather than trying to find the correct authority figure to tell you how to do it. You go, but all I'm doing is adding another channel. What if I just duplicated this over here and attached that and then change these values and boom, suddenly you've got it. Suddenly you're making up your own stuff. That's where you want to get. Yeah, Look Mom No Computer is very much like Chris on amphetamines. I don't think he's really on amphetamines. He's a YouTuber. He's doing it for attention and he's really good at it. And he's doing something that he cares about and loves, so it's sincere. It's just a little over the top. It's a little extra pumped up. He's this weird, funky, punkish British guy, and I enjoy him immensely. So on that note, let us bid the chat goodbye. And again, I can't deal with juice, so I wouldn't recommend that to a newbie. And, interesting, open source VSI. Yeah, that would be good. With that, I will say goodbye to the chat. And it's been fun. I'm going to be playing music on Tuesday and doing my Minecraft Hangout thing on Wednesday. I never announced that, so you got to follow this channel or like it and subscribe it and ding the little bell and stuff if you expect to hear about the Minecraft stuff going on, because I have stopped telling anybody when I do that. That is just for me and anybody who is paying close enough attention to want to tune in. You're quite welcome to, but I'm not going to promote it. And then lastly, the Thursday I'm going to do another music jam, and I'll continue trying to develop what I'm trying to do with that. So on that note, I'll talk to y'all later. Bye-bye.